So now, to my right, Bjørg, you're going to talk about NORAD, the Norwegian money that's gone in. And one of the things I'm particularly interested in is how you've done it.
I'll try. Try to summarize.
Thank you, Fabrice. Sorry, I should have said properly thank you. That was great.
I'll try to summarize that. So good afternoon, and thanks. Good to be here. Everything I was going to say now was mentioned or raised in the first session, which is great, which is means that we are more or less on the same page or thinking along the same lines. So I'll try to be very specific then.
Thank you.
About the work that Norway is involved in. The question, can aid donors help support LGBT rights? Well, obviously, I think the answer to that question is yes, as was raised earlier. How do we then do that? The way that we've framed it is that this is not an issue of that can be solved or which should be addressed only through the lens of aid. So on the part of Norway or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is the operational arm of our development assistance, we at NORAD, we provide technical advice.
Okay.
Which is a very nice place to be. So we framed it as this is an issue that should be promoted through a range of channels. You can't just use that one entry point of development assistance. So Norway, being traditionally a staunch supporter of human rights, has used a number of channels. So we believe, we have great faith in the multilateral system. So we place a lot of emphasis on what goes on in the Council for Human Rights in the UN, for example, and have promoted and backed the resolution that came up in 2011 and the subsequent report documenting discrimination, because we also believe it's important to bring out evidence, like was said here earlier. This is a sorry. So that was the sort of human rights machinery. If you think in terms of human rights, duty bearers, right holders, there's been a whole lot of work to support civil society organizations at country level. Starting, how did that come about? Our presence at country level is through embassies, I believe, although I wasn't there at the time. I believe some of this has evolved somewhat organically, in that through personal connections that hasn't really come up previously, but I believe that that's an important, probably was an important starting point. But obviously this came up very high on the Norwegian political agenda, and like Sunil Pant from Nepal mentioned, a systematic review was made of in which countries is there demand for Norwegian support for LGBT rights organizing. And 5 countries came through as clearly demanding this kind of support, and Nepal was one of them. So they were selected as pilot countries, or sort of first wave of support. Channeling support that way enabled us to provide what is often a problem in this context that we're talking about, quite small funds and quite a lot of follow-up. A problem, I think, for some of us who sit in capital and have those big bags of money is that we are set up to provide a lot of money with a little bit of follow-up, but great demand for reporting, whereas what's required maybe to support a lot of smaller grassroots organizations is small funds, but a bit more follow-up. So that's a dilemma. How do we try to resolve that? We try to resolve that by working through other organizations, larger organizations that can sub-grant so we can get back to that if people are interested, but there are some challenges in how the funds flow. So we have approached this issue very much as a human rights issue. I come from the world of sexual and reproductive health and rights and HIV, and it's a very different mindset. So it's just something that I wanted to throw out to the audience when I was listening to the previous speaker. How do you really bring out the good arguments to get this agenda understood? But human rights people and law people, to caricature a little bit, So sometimes say you have to do this because it's the law. You have to do this because it's the right thing to do. You have to do this because you signed up to it. Whereas from where I come from, we're more used to saying, well, we have to do this because it's useful. Inclusive development will help you achieve better results. It will be good for your economy. And it's two, as I think of it, two very different ways of thinking. And I just wonder if that's something that could be interesting to try to discuss or resolve in thinking about how to move forward.
Okay.
Another question that we've grappled with as well is, and it came up in the previous session, and I thought that was very interesting. LGBT rights, on the one hand, is very, very, very clear. This is about non-discrimination. This is about social justice. We have, and I should mention, and it's available for people who would like to see it. We've produced a guide, a very practical guide for our embassies, how they might work in countries to support grassroots organizing. Let me know afterwards, and I'll tell you where you can find it. But given that this is very complex issues, another question in my mind, and again it came up earlier, is it seems to me, and we are experiencing an incredible backlash, and it was mentioned previously, against women's rights, reproductive rights, sexual rights. It comes up in processes in the UN that we are involved in, and it comes up at country level. Clearly, it must be that on the one hand, we could say we are successful, so we are getting some reactions, but clearly they're very powerful forces, and I'm frankly quite worried about this backlash. And it seems to me that the conflation of sexual rights, reproductive rights, and so on, is, some people say that this conflation means that we need to keep them separate and work on them separately and argue them separately. Others might say that no, there are bigger questions at play, and therefore these need to be framed as, I think, was it Jessica mentioned earlier, that it seems to be this pressure on sexuality and anything to do with the body. Maybe that's where it's at. I don't know. But I'm wondering whether these are issues that we need to unpack a bit more to better understand how to address this. And finally, of course, the point about support, back to the solidarity issue. Clearly, those of us who come from a privileged north and have the privilege of some very willing taxpayers, big bag, or fairly big bag of money behind us to provide in development assistance, should not use that to push it on others. But there has to be that dialogue and spirit of partnership.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much indeed.